Well, good evening again. Here we are back, and I'm Bob Greaves. They call me the unconventional pastor. And tonight, I had originally planned on uh, even continuing on what I had started last Wednesday and continued on Sunday about critical thinking. And originally, what I was thinking is that tonight, what I wanted to do was uh, talk about specific examples of the failure of critical thinking and when people are not thinking critically, and try to give examples of what I saw in some of the theologies that used to appeal to me until I began to see how uh, the ways of being critically thought out. And I wanted to do that, and but as tonight approached, I came across some other things that I found to be far more commanding of my attention, and so I thought I would talk about that, and partly because I was very touched by the things that a friend of mine had to share. Um, she's asked me to change some of the names in her story, but she did give me permission to share the story, and so I want to talk a bit about her story and the dynamics of what really is going on with that story. And in a sense, this is also a continuation of one of the very first interviews I had was with Sister Lisa Bertolini. And she has a particular interest in teaching and reaching out toward people involving the topic of spiritual abuse. And today, a friend of mine was talking about, and for the last couple of days, talking a little bit more about this, as she's starting to discuss this in ways she's never been able to really talk about it before and write about it. And that is that she, from the age of 13, was rescued, as it were. She had been kidnapped as a child, living with the kidnapper. And when she was 12, she ended up then, being found, I guess. What happened is she's not really sure what the story is, but she suspects. And this is just a terrible thing for a 12-year-old to go through. She came home one day to the living where her kidnapper was to find him dead. And she believes that it's possible that he was actually shot by a girlfriend or some intimate friend and left there to make it look like she had done it. And she ended up in a foster home. And in that foster home, she then ended up being sent to Lester Roloff's home for girls, which I don't know if you know much about Lester Roloff, but he was a hardcore fundamentalist, and he ran some girls' homes and was a person who ended up being investigated by a variety of different organizations because he had homes in various states. But it turns out the story is that a man of tremendous, evidently, of tremendous abuse and what have you. An amazing story that this person has come through it and still is in good condition as they are based on all they've been through, because they went through what must have been a horrible child. Let me put this book. I'm reading a book here. My wife gave this to me for Christmas. It's the 3-Minute Einstein. What a clever guy he was. If only we could all be as clever. Well, actually, we all need to be what we are, I guess. Anyway, to have been kidnapped as a child and to not know necessarily what the story is with your parents or who you really are or whatever, I don't know. But and then to be rescued from that abusive situation, to then be placed into another terribly abusive situation, is just such a sad story. And the thing that's so sad about it is not just when you find out about these stories, but when you discover how terribly common they are. It is very disheartening, in many ways, very overwhelming. It's the kind of thing that is just so deeply disappointing to realize that human beings not only sink to that level, but they do so in the name of God and in the name of Jesus. Now, something, though, that seems to be true is that there is something about the religious mindset that if it gets involved in that kind of aberrant intensity, that it seems to go farther and more efficiently into a deeper condition than it does with people who are not as religious. That is, there's something about what I would call the religious mindset, not the spiritual mindset, but the religious mindset, the doctrinal, the dogmatic mindset that seems to be more more correlated with some of these sorts of abuse. Now, I certainly don't believe that this personality that lies behind a lot of this abuse causes fundamentalism. Nor do I think that fundamentalism causes this abusive mindset and personality disorder. Rather, I think that there's something else going on in the lives of the people that end up going through this sort of a thing that predisposes them or attracts them to or connects them to dynamics that make a fundamentalist or very dogmatic faith just seem very appealing. There's something about the structure cognitively of that kind of a faith, and something about the inability to deal with things socially and interpersonally that attract them to aberrant types of behavior and interaction. Now, they've, I guess psychologists used to call it sexual perversions. Now they call it paraphilias, sexual paraphilias. So they changed the name, but basically something that is less, it's less provocative, but more descriptive. Well, anyhow, I found that there was a time when I was developing this philosophy called, I called it vital love, where I sought to understand exactly what this love is that we find so vital, something other than affection, something other than just liking someone, but this sense of an awesome, arresting awareness of great value, and desire to behave in a way towards that which is valuable, that celebrates it and protects it from harm, to preserve it and all that, and that I saw that this sense of being vitally loved, having oneself sensed as being regarded as so valuable, that this is a value worth celebrating and a value worth protecting. That being loved in this way is tremendously important to our well-being and our development. And this is how I basically understand what must be going on in the love of God and in the presence of God. And this vital love, as it was a philosophy of mine that I was developing, I found that as a pastor at that time, that a number of people were coming to me to talk to me about this, because I was talking about it, even biblically in a sense, in a way that was a bit different from others. And as it also so happened, the way it worked out, is that a lot of people who were struggling with fundamentalist self-hatred and a wide variety of behavioral problems that were more like behavioral addictions, including sexuality, that a lot of these people were coming to me and talking to me, and that this particular approach was found to be meaningful and helpful and useful to them. And there was a time when I actually had a loosely put together organization called Agape Renewal, and eventually I stopped doing that because of all the opposition I was getting from the Bible-believing churches, who were quite alarmed at the things that I was saying and doing and what have you. And I wasn't interested in arguing or dealing with all of that at the time. And so it went by the wayside. But one of the things that I found in doing that was that I discovered that when I would talk to people about being loved in that way, that it was the fundamentalists or the very dogmatic Catholics, or the people who had a very rigid attachment to a very absolute, certain, and guilt-driven faith, were very opposed to accepting the idea that they were not wretched to God, that they were lovely to God, that they needed to find that loveliness within themselves, believe in it, and celebrate it in a very real way as their life. And I found that there was a great resistance, not only with these people who were very religious, to that concept of self. They didn't want to think about it because it seemed like so much heresy. I also found that when they came to me with these behavioral addictions in them, that they were in deep, and that the shame they felt over just their existence was a huge driving force to those behavioral addictions. And that's when I realized that a lot of these people were hiding very difficult and horrible behaviors that were really to them, and they wouldn't admit it because their religion would condemn them for doing so, driven very much by the shame of their self-hatred, that they would sometimes, well, God now loves me, and so I will love myself, and I will do that to obey God. And so all sorts of ways they spin it, but down deep inside, their core sense of self was that they were ugly, despicable, and had it not been for the blood of Christ, even God would have to vomit them away because he couldn't possibly tolerate their actual presence and value. But I found these people very difficult to work with in terms of loosening them from that kind of a bond. And it was later that I began to make the connections, and I realized that this kind of shame is also very strongly associated with very abusive behaviors. It is almost as if even people who perhaps sincerely mean well and want to love God and want to honor God, but yet accept this doctrine that they are so disgusting to God and all sin is disgusting to God, that there comes times, I think, that when this becomes difficult to manage within themselves, and they vent it by being very abusive. And the amount of abuse that can actually go on inside of many fundamentalist type religions is amazing. And a lot of it is underground, hidden, and the scandals are hidden in various ways. It is amazing to me. I mean, even recently when Jack Sprague, was it? I can't remember his name. The guy from Jack Kyle's old church there in Hammond, Indiana, when he was found to have been having an inappropriate relationship with a teenager there associated with the church. Teenager was blamed for having seduced him. He was comforted for having been seduced, and yet his behavior as an adult and supposedly as a man of God who believes that the gospel has made him pure and holy before Jesus Christ, and he the kind of a person who condemns every behavior that all sorts of people have that is contrary to the calling and the holiness of the life we're called in Christ. Just amazing that some of these people, the way that they deal with it and work with it and the way they bury it and deny it is just amazing. But I began to see that there was this strong connection between the drive towards a lot of this aberrant behavior and the abuse and the attraction to a very dogmatic, a demanding, rigid religious mindset. So as I would look at this, I began to try to understand what some of these things were caused by, and I got the impression that a lot of these problems were really caused by something that I think a guy by the name of Dr. Money actually calls it something like a love map. And there are other maps that are going on inside. And the basic concept here is this, that as we're developing as human beings, we create these maps in our mind, as it were. And by that, it's meant we have this concept of well-formed or badly formed or properly formed or improperly formed, but nonetheless formed, of the road we anticipate we will be on and where the road ought to lead and what it would be like. And in our sexual map, we at a very young age, based on the trauma that we go through, develop a distorted map of just what it would mean for that sexual fulfillment. And then when the puberty comes along and that energizes us in our drive toward that sort of fulfillment, well, then this love map comes into play, and you start pursuing it. And if that love map has been developed in a way that has been distorted through trauma, through abuse, your sense of that map will be one where the things that you find that you're pursuing are, and it's not like you ever choose them. They just seem to be there as just apparently naturally quite attractive. But the same thing is true of the abuse and the control. It seems to just naturally make sense that if you've got a person here who's a wicked, evil, awful sinner, that the thing you need to do is whip them into shape. I first learned of Lester Roloff when I attended Bob Jones University, and he was very closely associated with the university, and I'd heard his name a few times, and I knew he had a home for girls, and I knew he was sometimes liked by John R. Rice, and I had attached myself somewhat to John R. Rice, became a John R. Rice associate, but I didn't really pay too much attention to Lester Roloff and who he was in particular. He had homes for girls. I think he also may have had some homes for boys. I don't know. But since I wasn't going to one and wasn't in one, I really didn't pay attention to it. But then there was this magazine article that appeared, and I can't remember where it was. I think it was actually in like Time Magazine or U.S. News and World Report, or one of those news magazines back then in the 70s. And the title of the article was "Whippin' Lil Gals for God" or something like that. And I read the article, and I remember reading the article and feeling very uncomfortable about what seemed to be going on, and it just struck me as being somewhat abusive. But I never really thought much about it thereafter. I'd left Bob Jones. I was already shifting in my sense of fundamentalism, so that I was no longer as attached to that way of thinking, and so in some sense, I'd moved on. Just moving on in a different direction. But it wasn't until later that I actually had an opportunity to spend some time with Dave Hiles, Jack Hiles' son, and Dave had come to the Binghamton area to visit some churches, and I was responsible for driving him around and getting him back to the airport and stuff like that. And we both went shopping in an old bookstore and did things like that, and spent some time with him. And he was an extremely fundamentalist fellow at that time, and struck me at the time as being very worn out and tired and exhausted. And he kept a very arduous schedule, apparently. But the one thing that amazed me when he was preaching that one day, and he preached mostly to youth, it began bothering me that he had this youth ministry, but he was supposedly some youth expert, but he was really just a fundamentalist who had decided to deal with youth because that's what he did when he was 16, I guess, and he just never stopped doing that. But he was preaching about this one day, he was just preaching very condemning about the fact that the girls were wearing T-shirts that had writing on them. And he was talking about how this was some sort of plan and plot of the devil to get men to actually look at their boobs, and I'm thinking to myself, I think you got to start taking responsibility for what you're doing with your eyes, and it struck me as just being kind of weird and odd that he would do that. But after that, I drove him to the airport after that weekend was over, and I don't think I ever really saw him again. But it wasn't. I don't recall exactly how much later it was. I began hearing stories about him. He'd been kicked out of a church. Apparently, there was all of these rumors of this relationship, that relationship, this relationship, that relationship, and all sorts of things. But then the horrifying story started coming out that he was involved in apparently the death of someone, but his father had apparently done something to make sure that the judges wouldn't do. But it was a horrible story. If you want to read it for yourself, I suppose there's a lot of it out there on the internet. And one site you could look at is there's if you were to Google the word Babylon and the name Dave Hiles, you probably find the website where some of that information is actually kind of documented. And there's a lot of other stories. Recently, his younger sister, I think, has also been involved. She's become a life coach, and she very much speaks against this fundamentalist religion and all the horrible things that went on inside of that church and the family and dynamics. And she became an outcast in that family. But what a courageous person she was. But anyhow, all of this, and these coming from people who were upheld as being the finest example of arduous, soul-winning Christians that I had learned about at Bob Jones University. And it's all starting to fall apart for me as I look at it and see what's going on. And realizing that in some of these areas, there's just some deep and awful abuse. And as I begin to look at some of the teachings that these fundamentalists were teaching about church discipline and all that, particularly in putting this together with some of the things that I was learning later as I developed this, what I called, vital love and the agape renewal outreach. This really spoke to me that there is something traumatically damaged sometimes in these people. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that fundamentalism itself is always appealing to people who are deeply damaged. But what I'm saying is that sometimes the very deeply damaged people are the very ones who are powerfully attracted to fundamentalism, seek positions of leadership and influence. And part of the reason why they end up doing that, I think, is that they are, some of them, genuinely and sincerely hoping that an arduous pursuit of God is going to help them find a way of controlling what's out of control that nobody yet knows is way out of control. Or they are, or this is something they see as an opportunity where in Bible-believing churches, there's this radical independence from the government, from accountability, from larger organizations, from accountability committees, and all sorts of things. And I think that some of them actually see this as, wow, if this isn't a great harvest field for me. And no doubt some of them are really somewhere in between where they're hoping that, this deep commitment to faith is going to help deliver them. But in the process, they begin to recognize all the marvelous opportunities they have to act out inappropriate behavior. And it comes that way. Anyhow, let me see. I wanted to take a look at some of these notes. There's I'm not going to say too much more about David Hiles. Other than that, to me, this was particularly a disappointing discovery, because when I had gone to Bob Jones, I was really impressed with Jack Hiles, and at least impressed with the results he seemed to be getting. At a church, I don't know, I can't remember, something like 15 or 20,000 people. And all from knocking on doors and, if you were to die today, do you know whether or not you'd be in the heaven? And he had a soul winning course and all this. And to me, I thought, what a wonderful thing. He's getting all these results, all of these people saved and all that. And so I had liked that guy a lot and hoped to be able to be as effective as he was. And, originally as a young preacher, 21 or 22 and all that, hoping to be able to be effective. So to see that really fall apart as something where something very corrupt was going on was a disappointment, because as I looked into it, almost all of the dynamic churches that I looked into where these sorts of marvelous so-called things were going on, there was all sorts of scandal and difficulty being covered up. I even became involved with a church. I won't mention the name of it, but the pastor there was one of the only few people personally ordained by Jerry Falwell, and there's
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have lost the unconventional pastor. Let's get him back. In the meantime, I'm going to get crew member to play some music. Crew member, play some music. Much better.
And we made it back. I don't know what happened, some sort of a glitch, I guess, but it's good to be here. And let me continue on where I was. I was talking a little bit about how it was so disappointing to discover how, these connections that at one time were so inspiring to me, or that had become my aspiration, were beginning to fall apart and beginning to strike me as having some serious problems often attached to them. I'm not going on into that too much more. I want to get on to the things that this friend of mine shared recently, and she was talking about what she experienced, about how she first met Lester Roloff because he was the owner of Bethesda, which was a home. And when she was there, there was I guess a Bob and a Betty Wills who were in charge of the day-to-day stuff, and they operated it. But Lester Roloff was definitely the guy who was in charge. And she was changed. She was chained to a pipe for several days, as she had to listen to Lester Roloff's sermon tapes. They were just blasted. And the lights in the room were never off, and she was not allowed to shower at all during those several days. And she was locked in that room and beaten with a device that looked to her like a baseball bat cut in half, so that it was flattened on one side, as if it had been split down the middle or something. And maybe it actually had broken one way and that way and was an interesting cut. Who knows? Anyway, she wasn't there because she was pregnant, like some of the other girls were. But even though she wasn't pregnant, she found that many of the pregnant girls who were there were severely beaten in spite of the fact that they were pregnant, and demeaned in front of everyone else for being whores and sluts and all sorts of things. But the crime that caused her to be actually sent to Bethesda was that when she had been kidnapped as a young girl and taken out of her home, and then later when her kidnapper died and she was able to get free, she was now in a foster home. She was only 12 years old at the time she went into the foster home, and when she lived with the kidnapper, she was often starved. And so she began to hoard food into her room from her foster parents. And they were they disliked this habit of hers of taking the food. And she felt it was motivated by the fact that, she had been starved oftentimes with her kidnapper. And she just was afraid these people would also start to take the food away. Well, these foster parents were strong adherents of Bob Jones University, and they actually talked to a fellow there by the name of Walter Fremont, who is the dean of the School of Religion there, Bob Jones University at that time. And Walter suggested that the first thing you need to do is if she's going to be hoarding food, you need to discipline her and take the food away from her and not let her eat for 2 or 3 days, and which only, confirmed for her the reality that she was right for hoarding the food, because this is exactly how they responded. Well, she didn't react well to that. And then their next step was, to send her over to Lester Roloff, who was going to really take care of her. And so, in a sense, these were the crimes that got her diagnosed as in need of this home for girls. She was just a scared 13-year-old girl who had just been convinced that these people would probably stop feeding her too. Now, when she talked about the way that she had lived with her previous kidnapper on the farm, she used to listen to Billy Joel records. And of course, that was something she was able to listen to. But here in this new home, the Bob Jones and the anti-rock and roll and all that stuff, she wasn't allowed to do that. And in many ways, her foster home, which was this fundamentalist home, acted as if all of these rules she was breaking are obvious rules that everybody knows are rules that ought not to be violated. Everybody knows Billy Joel is of the devil and stuff like that. And so, therefore, her being out of that context, her hoarding the food, her not reacting well to having been disciplined in that way, her deep insecurities, and she's just a 12, 13-year-old girl, ended her up in with Brother Lester Roloff. I'm reading some of the notes I have here from what she said. Anyway, Lester Roloff used to take certain girls with him to certain places and have meetings where he would, raise money for the home for girls. Now, he wouldn't tell people that he would actually tell people he never received a nickel from the government, that this was a complete act of faith. But in truth, many of these girls living there were actually receiving Social Security payments, either because their parents had died or other things. And Lester Roloff was one actually receiving all of their Social Security, as he had become their, I I can't remember what they call it, but in Social Security, if you're receiving benefits and you're not allowed to have them, there might be someone who's they're the person who's not your guardian, but well, anyway, they're the person that the checks get sent to on your behalf, and they have to fill out the reports. I can't remember what they call it. But anyway, so there was this big money making attempt at what was going on. And Lester would take these girls around, and she talks about one girl. I'm going to call her Joan. That's not her real name. But she talks about how Joan, the story of Joan haunts her to this day. Joan had only one leg. She was an unwanted foster child. Not really a bad girl. She wasn't a drug addict. She wasn't a prostitute. She was quiet. She didn't really have much to say to anybody. But she was part of Roloff's circus, of girls that he would take around with him to promote the home for girls, and he told a story about her, and I don't remember now whether or not the story was actually true or not. But Lester Roloff would tell this heart-wrenching story. Anyway, he'd have Joan come on up to the front, and she would hobble up because she had a prosthetic leg. And he'd talk about how she was in a drug-induced haze and was laying on the tracks and had actually been run over and lost her leg, to the train wreck. And this was a tremendous selling point, and a lot of people would be just so touched by the story. And the staff would, but when Joan would get back to the school, they would take her prosthetic away from her because they didn't want her to go away anywhere. And they were concerned that sometimes with that prosthetic leg, she could actually get to hopping along pretty good, maybe even outrun the staff. But they ridiculed her, and they would often pull her prosthetic leg off and put it in storage until the next time Roloff was ready to go out on a trip. And there were times, though, when they would discipline her. One time she was in a church, and she decided to leave a note and in one of the Bibles in the church to tell people what was really going on. And but a member of the church found it, told Lester Roloff about the note, and this girl was soundly beaten, including being beaten with her prosthetic leg. And this is the kind of thing going on. But I'm not going to go too much more into this, but as a result, that note actually got found by other people as well, and it ended up the government coming in and taking a bunch of people away. But I think this girl got shipped out to some other home in a different state, so that they never got her. It looks like we got some comments coming in. Let me see what we have here. Okay. Anyway, your comment: religious abusers are sick, and so is the religious right. So sad. I agree with you. And I'm not talking about this to be salacious, and I'm not trying to, get us all to groan. But I think it's a very real part of this rigid faith. Now, I'm not saying that everybody involved in that rigid faith is this way, but I am saying that the people who do have this sorts of problems are very much attracted to that rigid kind of faith. And when they get into it, they become particularly severe cases of these sorts of problems. And it is amazing to me when you realize some of the horrible things that people have gone through as a result of being involved with some of the more weird people in these groups. He ran several homes and took advantage of many of the girls. They were not allowed to talk to each other when they were back in the on the home. They although they would sometimes room together, there was severe discipline if they were chit-chatting with each other. This friend of mine that was telling me about her experience there, and she's a very nice person, was talking about a time when they had a girl there who had just arrived there. Her parents had been killed in an automobile accident. She didn't quite work out well in the foster home, and she ended up here in Lester Roloff's home. I just, I can't imagine how horrible that sequence of events must have been for that young girl. But anyway, she was standing there sobbing very uncontrollably, and this friend of mine went to e- offer her a hug and was stopped and severely disciplined for doing that. These people were not allowed to comfort each other. They were allowed to talk to each other. They were made to be completely dependent upon people who controlled them and owned them, as it were. And the more select among them would be used for the great heart-wrenching stories and preaching examples they could be, and the singing that they would do for Lester Roloff. And of course, they had to learn how to put on the smiles and act like being in Jesus was just such the most wonderful thing that had changed their lives. And it's so sad when you stop to think about it. But I think it's important that we realize that that the fundamentalist faith is not a faith that is sick for all of the people in it, but it is a faith that, in my opinion, is inappropriately rigid and inappropriately cut off from the rest of culture and inappropriately isolates itself so that it really not only invites this kind of behavior but hides it. And 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 that when it happens, it can be a very difficult thing to discover, to uncover, and to rescue people from. But the tremendous damage it does to people who begin to wonder if this is really their ordained by God lot in life is amazing. I think Lester Roloff is no longer with us. He certainly went the way of the dust, I guess. But it's important, I think, for us to realize that abuse is a real part of a lot of this religion. And it's not surprising. The religion itself seems to believe in an abusive God who is nonetheless a benevolently abusive God. And the story they tell and the fears they have and even the glory of God as they describe it oftentimes is of a person in their own damage. They're often totally unaware of just how awful this God is that they talk about. They can talk about it and give this testimony, and they think that people are going to hear this and go, oh, what a wonderful, I'd love to know this God. Instead, when people hear some of the things they have to say about this God, they go, I don't want anything to do with an ass like that. Not at all. That's just not and or if they become convinced that, there's any authority to the Bible as it's being presented to them and this gospel as it's being preached to them, they feel they have no choice but to make terms with their potential tormentor and the person who will captivate them. The alternative is hell, I guess. So, that's the lesser of all the evils. And, they don't realize that they present God as an option in life that's the lesser of two enormously huge evils. And to think that there's people who not only teach this sort of thing, but then there's other people who are caught up in this sort of thing, innocent victims, captivated, tortured and abused in this sort of thing. It is so heart-wrenching to realize what is going on. Anyway, she talked quite a bit about a lot of these other girls that Lester Roloff would make up even various stories about what was going to happen to them, and he would tell people that these kids are going to end up back on the street and in prostitution and drugs if you don't give us money and help us to raise these little girls for God. Anyway. There was a message there, but it got removed. A little thing popped up. Maybe something else will come up. Anyway, no, it's there. Okay. Totally agree, Bob. Keep telling it like it is. So sad. Anyhow, it's we got Rap Within 5. That was a comment I wasn't supposed to make. Anyway, um, it is amazing in hearing these stories. I can't imagine what it was like for people going through that. But I think it's radically important that we realize that we're not just arguing against a faith that we disagree with. When I mean, as a person who believes that God loves us all, as a person who really believes that we are all in a process of being regathered to God, that none of us are in danger of any of this crazy stuff in terms of, we are headed for hell and all that. There's a sense in which, well, you know what? I don't know how it's going to work out. And if I can alleviate some of this suffering, I guess I can. I will. But I'm not worried about how it's all going to turn out in the end. But at the same time, I do find that I want to be outspoken because I'm hoping that by being outspoken, it'll help to make a difference with some of the people who are really caught up in this, and to recognize that we need to take a real close look at this kind of theology. We need to really examine it and understand it. And in some sense, I really think a lot of people are better off just rejecting the whole notion of God than embracing some of these very abusive concepts of God. Like see people learn what it is to enjoy the presence of a God who adores them, but at the same time, that's just not all people are going to be persuaded of that easily. But I think it's very important that we speak up, that we talk about the kind of abuses that do go on and how these abuses are not just going on throughout society, but particularly within some of these more rigid churches in a way that becomes far more severe than it does in the other parts of society that might experience some of these problems. It seems to attract that the borderline personality disorder, the narcissist, all the variety of these people with various paraphilias. And it is amazing to me just the kind of eye-opening events that you can go through. I don't want to go through too many other details. Some of them are just way too gruesome. But I do want to talk a little bit here about a love that does not believe in abuse. I want to talk a little bit about a love that I believe is a real love, a love where people are regarded as precious enough that this is not a love that necessarily doesn't believe in consequences or discipline or honesty or dealing with issues that need to be dealt with, but it is a love that honors and values the person and their experience, who they are, appreciates and understands the problems they have and the difficulties they have, and seeks to accommodate their developmental needs, to soothe their pain and their scars, and that there is a love that comes from God that is a totally different animal, a totally different genre than this gospel of this turn or burn of a God who is just so angry and disgusted with you that if it weren't for Jesus getting between you and him, you're toast. There's a love there that is far more vital. A love which I think is really there even in the text of the scripture when it's properly translated, not translated in its hyperbolic extremes, to turn it into a tool for use of an institutional church that wants to usurp a power when Jesus himself said, all authority is given to me in heaven and earth. And when it comes to our spirituality, we are all as loved and it's all invited to the power and presence of God. Even people who don't even necessarily understand that's what's going on, But anyhow, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. I was so touched and so overwhelmed by this story of a friend of mine that I really wanted to talk about it. I really wanted to share it. This horrible abuse that can go on inside of fundamentalism. And it's not always just extreme. Sometimes it's really just that ordinary abuse that doesn't necessarily physically beat people up or destroy them completely. It just makes them feel like they're nothing but garbage. And this is who they are. And they try to find some way of spiritually and religiously living in the glory and grace of God who would love them anyway. Doesn't make any sense to me. Anyhow, we'll see you next time. This is Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. thanks for listening to my little rant. I appreciated being able to talk to you about it. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Graves.